Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament. We are now back in the book of Acts. Like I said, we're going to be in Acts for 2 days, and then we're going to hop back into Second Corinthians and start the study there. And so, again, we're continuing this chronological study. We've titled it "This is Church." Basically, what it is just looking at the New Testament church in chronological order, going through the starting in Acts, going all the way through Revelation, looking at the things that the church dealt with, the issues they had, the things like Paul and other authors wrote about. And so today we're looking at the riot in Ephesus, and this is Acts 19:21 through 41. And I am going to read this one. It's a little bit longer, but I like this. This is an interesting story. We don't see a lot of things like this, and this one's a very detailed story. And so I wanted to go into that. So looking at Acts 19, starting verse 21, it says, "Afterwards, Paul felt compelled by the Spirit to go over to Macedonia and Achaia before going to Jerusalem, and after that he said, I must go on to Rome. He sent his two assistants, Timothy and Aristus, as I believe is how you say his name, ahead to Macedonia while he stayed a while longer in the province of Asia. About that time, serious trouble developed in Ephesus concerning the way. It began with Demetrius, a silversmith who had a large business manufacturing silver shrines of the Greek goddess Artemis. He kept many craftsmen busy. He called them together along with others employed in similar trades and addressed them as follows: Gentlemen, you know that our wealth comes from this business, but as you have seen and heard, this man Paul has persuaded many people that homemade gods aren't really gods at all. And he's done this not only here in Ephesus, but throughout the entire province. Of course, I'm not just talking about the loss of public respect for our business. I'm also concerned that the temple of the great Artemis, or the great goddess Artemis, will lose its influence, and that Artemis, this magnificent goddess worshipped throughout the province of Asia and all around the world, will be robbed of her great prestige. At this, their anger boiled, and they began shouting, Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Soon, the whole city was filled with confusion. Everyone rushed to the amphitheater, dragging along Gaius, and I'm going to try to pronounce this right. I believe it is Aristarchus, who were Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. Paul wanted to go in too, but the believers wouldn't let him. Some of the officials of the province, friends of Paul, also sent a message to him, begging him not to risk his life by entering the amphitheater. Inside, the people were all shouting, some one thing and some other. Everything was in confusion. In fact, most of them didn't even know why they were there. The Jews in the crowd pushed Alexander forward and told him to explain the situation. He motioned for silence and tried to speak, but when the crowd realized he was a Jew, they started shouting again and kept it up for about 2 hours. That's a lot. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. At last, the mayor was able to quiet them down enough to speak. Citizens of Ephesus, he said, everyone knows that Ephesus is the official guardian of the temple of the great Artemis, whose image fell up down to us from our heaven. We'll talk about that in a minute. Since this is an undeniable fact, you should stay calm and do not do anything rash. You have brought these men here, but they have stolen nothing from the temple and have not spoken against our goddess. If Demetrius and the craftsmen have a case against them, let the against them. The courts are in session, and the officials can hear their case at once. Let them make formal charges, and if there are complaints about other matters, they can be settled in a legal assembly. I'm afraid we are in danger of being charged with rioting by the Roman government, since there is no cause for all this commotion. And if Rome demands an explanation, we won't know what to say. Then he dismissed them, and they disappeared. And so, a huge thing. A lot happens in a short little, 20 some verses here. And so we see, going back to the beginning of this, Paul wrote First Corinthians during the springtime, near the end of his time in Ephesus, that we see here. And so it was shortly after this, or shortly before this, that he wrote First Corinthians. Paul sent the letter to Corinth with Timothy and Aristus, and then left for Ephesus to go through Macedonia, and eventually to Corinth himself as well. And we're going to see that going into Second Corinthians. Aristus was a Corinthian and is included in Paul's greetings in Romans and in Second Timothy. We'll see that as we go further. The accounts of Paul's Ephesians ministries concludes with a riot here against Paul that was provoked by the silversmith Demetrius that we saw, right? And one of the ways that Paul writes, or Luke writes about here, is he refers to as the way, and that was the way with the Christianity was referred to as the way many times. They weren't, Christian was actually a derogatory term. They were referred to as the way sometimes, and so they had a few different names that was used to refer to the church here. But anyways, this guy's real problem was that Paul's stance against idolatry was hurting his business. That's why I was really upset. But he added more, right, accusations and things to make it more volatile, to arouse civic and religious pride, and to get an uproar. And so the reason they did this, right, because silver shrines were replicas of the temple of Artemis, and they were used for home altars or as offerings to be presented to the goddess on as often as daily, right? So they would worship her daily, and so his statements were true. Like what he said about it was true, because Paul did preach against idolatry, and people from all of Asia that did and the world did flock to Ephesus to worship Artemis, and so you have that. So practically, right, if they had particularly they had a week-long festival, dedicated to the goddess, where people would come and they would make a ton of money off it. So basically Paul and Christianity was hurting his business, and so that's why he starts this. And so he was not wrong in linking Artemis to the civic, economic, and religious interests of that city, right? If Christianity won out, then these guys, like all this stuff, it would hurt the city. And so we see all this happen, and we see them rush to the amphitheater. The Ephesian theater had a capacity of about 12,000 people in Paul's time, and it was the place of assembly for the regular town business meetings of that area. And so apparently somehow we see that the two that were captured were eventually released, since they reappear in Paul's as Paul's frequent companion. Man, I'm sorry, y'all. And we see that later on in Acts 20, 27, Colossians, and Philemon. So we see that nothing happened to them. But as the main focal point, Paul, right? Paul was in mortal danger. He had two of Paul's followers, but they were really looking for Paul and go after Paul. But Paul's fellow Christians were right to hold him back. It probably would not have worked out well for Paul to walk into that theater. And so, and we see, as we see with most mobs and things like that, confusion reigned. Many of them didn't even know why they were there, right? How many of y'all seen that? Like a fight breaks out or something fights out, and you just join it. You don't know why you're joining. You don't know why you're there, but they do that. And so they're meeting. They're going on for hours, right? And so we have the Jew named Alexander tries to get them to come down, but they don't. And so maybe he was trying to disassociate the Jews from the Christians and say, hey, let's calm down. We're not like them. But the crowd shouted him down because they knew, right, that the Jews opposed foreign gods as well. So it's like, why are you talking? Well, we know that you're the problem as well. And so finally, the town clerk, or the mayor, for the most part, but basically was the chief administrator of the officer of the city, right? He was able to get them to calm down. He was the liaison between the town and the Roman officials, and so he was been the one that kind of represented the city, and he assured the crowd that look, the city's reputation is secure. We're good, right? Y'all can settle down, right? and he mentions the image of Artemis that falls from the sky. So more than likely, that was a meteor, and meteorites have been known or were associated with her worship. So we see that as well. And so that's probably why they talk about her falling from the sky, and there's a reference in that. And so he says, look, y'all need to take this to the courts. And so the legal means for settling disputes were conducted by a Roman official, and they had scheduled meetings of the town assembly, right? And so they had what was called proconsuls, right? And this was the head of a government in a Roman province. And so they would have basically gone to him and heard the arguments and stuff like that. And it's like, that's where that needs to be taking place. Don't do this here, right? Because what happens is Rome was very, very strict on riots or unlawful assemblies or people gathering and things like this that look like they could be uprisings. And so Rome would shut these things down fast. And if you did not control that, then Rome came into your city and controlled your city for you, right? Instead of letting you govern and report back to Rome and just report to the Roman officials, Rome was going to come in and overtake everything. And so he's like, right, look, this crowd in the theater has the appearance of an unlawful assembly, and you are risking bringing Rome in. And so y'all need to stop. You need to calm down and stop this. And so that's what happens. They disperse, and we see that nothing. It doesn't appear anyone was harmed or anything like that. And so what I like about Luke's extensive report on this, right? And he goes into the careful reasoning of the town clerk, and I think a lot of that provided an important basis for Christianity and other cities that we see that Luke and them write about, where they could defend themselves, right? So since Luke shows here, and he also shows elsewhere in Acts and other writings, that the Christian gospel was not contrary to the Roman rule of law and was not disruptive of public order, and that the actual accusations made that they have here are untrue. And so Luke's using this as an example of saying, hey, we're not against Rome. We're not trying to take down Rome, right? We're not against the rule of law. This is just what we believe, and this is who we worship. So it's like, look, right, we can coexist, and so I think that's part of what Luke tries to prove in a lot of his writings as we've gone through here and looked at these. And so, all right, I hope that you like this. I hope you learned something from it. It's honestly not something that we see preached or taught on a whole lot, because it's more history than it is anything. Not a lot of biblical doctrine no biblical doctrine that I can think of it comes out of this, but it's just history. And like that's what a lot of Acts is the history of the church. And so it's good to see, and we see some of the things that Paul went through again, and he writes about some of it in 2 Corinthians, which we're getting ready to get into. And so again, I hope you learn from this. I hope you like it. Again, it's just something that we see happens, and it's an example of what to expect sometimes maybe in Christianity as Christians. And so again, as always, I appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch these. I highly recommend that you subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so. That way you get the notifications when we publish daily. And as always, I appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch.